Picture this: turquoise water, private jets landing on tiny airstrips, and endless champagne flowing on a tropical island that looks straight out of a postcard. Now, imagine a tanned American billionaire at the center of it all. The man who sponsors cricket tournaments, shakes hands with presidents, and calls himself the new face of Caribbean finance. Sounds glamorous, right? Well, behind the mirrored sunglasses and the million-dollar smile, something massive was brewing, something that would later be called one of the largest financial frauds in history. Alan Stanford wasn't your typical Wall Street tycoon. He didn't come from Manhattan boardrooms or the gray suits of corporate America. He came from Texas, a land where confidence can sell anything, from oil fields to dreams. Stanford had that unstoppable Southern charm, the kind that makes you want to trust him instantly. He used it like a weapon, one that could open doors in governments and draw in money from people across 5 continents. If charisma were a currency, he would have been richer than some nations. But let's rewind a bit, because frauds of that scale don't appear overnight. During the 80s, while the financial world was obsessed with mergers and high-yield junk bonds, Stanford was quietly building something on a Caribbean island called Antigua. Why Antigua, you ask? Because small islands make big opportunities if you know how to play the game. They're places with light regulations, where financial oversight can be, let's say, flexible. Perfect conditions for someone clever enough to make his own rules. At first, his bank, a modest thing called Stanford International Bank, looked legitimate enough. It offered something very simple: certificates of deposit, or CDs. Nothing exotic there. A CD is basically a time deposit. You lock your money for a certain period, and in exchange, you get a fixed interest rate, usually higher than a normal savings account. Safe, predictable, boring. But here's where the magic happened. Stanford promised his clients interests way above the market average. While other banks offered 3 or 4%, Stanford went twice, sometimes 3 times higher. Crazy returns, right? Too good to ignore, too good to be real. Now, you might be thinking, who would fall for that? But hold that thought. Because if something sounds too good to be true but looks safe enough, people love to believe it. That's human. Stanford sold not just high returns, but the illusion of total safety. His bank looked solid. His image screamed success. And Antigua's palm trees made the whole thing feel like a ticket to financial paradise. Seriously, who wouldn't want to park their savings in a place that looks like a travel ad? He didn't stop there. Marketing was his art form. Stanford wasn't hiding underground like most fraudsters. He was everywhere, on TV, at sports events, and even posing with famous politicians. He dressed in white linen suits, flashing his usual confident grin, projecting the image of a modern elegant magnate who understood both finance and flair. He even became a knight, a literal one. The government of Antigua crowned him Sir Alan Stanford, as if a title could convert reputation into legitimacy. Spoiler alert, it did for a while. That knighthood wasn't just an ego boost, it was a business tool. Every handshake, every photograph, and every glittering party built a fortress of credibility around him. People don't question a man who gets knighted. They just assume he must have done something great. Stanford capitalized on that trust, weaving his charm through every layer of society, from top officials to everyday investors just trying to grow their savings. He learned early that perception, not performance, is what moves money. Now, let's pause for a second. Imagine you're an investor back then. You're sitting on some cash, the stock market's been a roller coaster, and your local bank gives you peanuts in returns. Then, this friendly cosmopolitan banker from Antigua says, "Hey, I can give you 7, 8, even 10% safely, backed by real investments." Add the suits, the awards, and the sense of exclusivity, and boom, you're tempted. It's the oldest trick in the book, just polished with Caribbean sunlight. Behind the scenes, though, things weren't as smooth as they looked. The real question is, where did those amazing returns come from? Spoiler, they didn't come from magic investments or genius strategies. The money that old clients received came straight from new clients putting in fresh deposits. That's what makes it a Ponzi scheme. Named after Charles Ponzi, the Italian swindler from the early 1900s who promised huge returns from postal coupons, when in reality, he was just recycling new money to pay old investors. Different era, same idea, just tropical rebranding. Stanford wasn't stupid, though. He wrapped his scam in the trappings of legitimacy. His bank supposedly invested in high-quality, low-risk assets. Government bonds, securities, conservative portfolios, at least on paper. But in reality, those investments were either grossly inflated, non-existent, or redirected into his personal empire. Mansions, jets, yachts, you name it, he owned it. It's like using your friend's trust fund to buy a private island and still expecting a thank you card. As his wealth and reputation grew, so did the fantasy. At its peak, Stanford International Bank claimed over $8 billion in deposits from around 100 countries. That's not pocket change. We're talking about teachers, retirees, small business owners, all convinced they were part of something elite. The tragic part? Many truly believed they had found a safe haven from the chaos of traditional banking. No one suspected that paradise had termites in its foundation. Here's where things get fascinating. Stanford didn't just rely on promises of high returns. He built culture. He made his clients feel special, part of a club. They got glossy reports, personalized attention, and lavish receptions. Human psychology loves that. When we feel special, we stop questioning. It's what made his scam almost artistic in design. Part finance, part theater. You might say, but surely the regulators saw this coming? Well, not exactly. That's the beauty and danger of operating from a jurisdiction like Antigua. Local authorities often lacked the resources and motivations to dig too deep, especially when the man financing half of the island's infrastructure was the same one running the bank. Talk about a conflict of interest. On top of that, Stanford ran subsidiaries across the United States, Europe, and Latin America, giving the illusion of a global institution. Anyone trying to piece it together got lost in a maze of jurisdictions and polished accounting documents. Meanwhile, Allen himself lived like a king, literally. Multi-million-dollar homes, a private jet with his initials, and billion-dollar cricket tournaments broadcast across the world. He didn't just want money, he wanted adoration. There's something almost theatrical about how far he went to sustain his image. He even built an entire sports complex in Antigua just to host matches under his name, bringing legendary players to the Caribbean. Every match was another step in the myth-building, reinforcing the idea. This man must be legitimate. Let's be honest, most people confuse confidence with competence. That's exactly what happened here. The more Stanford flaunted his wealth, the more investors trusted him. It's ironic, right? The richer you look, the less anyone asks where the money comes from. The whole operation was a masterclass in financial storytelling. From a Texan salesman to a Caribbean knight, he played every role flawlessly. But deep down, all of it depended on one fragile thing: trust. The kind that's easy to gain when everything goes up, and brutally fragile when cracks begin to show. You might be wondering, how can something that enormous go unnoticed for so long? That's the question that will follow us through the next few chapters. The truth is, people didn't want to see the warning signs. Greed and optimism make excellent blindfolds. Still, there's a lesson right here. Even before the fall begins, no matter how charming someone seems, or how many trophies they pose with, money always obeys the same laws. If someone promises you unusually high returns with zero risk, you should immediately raise an eyebrow. Stanford built his empire on ignoring that basic rule, and millions paid the price for believing him. All because paradise makes people dream louder and think slower. Before we dive into how he actually sold those seductive fake deposits and how thousands of investors joined the carnival, remember this: every scam starts with a story. Stanford's story was tailored perfectly for its time. Globalized, elegant, and utterly confident. And just like any good story, it had a beginning filled with glamour, a middle full of deception, and an ending most of his investors never saw coming. Buckle up, because next, we're going to see how that dream turned into a billion-dollar illusion that fooled the entire world. So, here's where the dream really starts to take shape. Imagine you just watched a smiling banker step off a private jet in Antigua, palm trees swaying behind him, promising you not only safety, but prosperity. He's not selling stocks, not crypto, not some get-rich-quick scheme. He's offering you something that sounds old school, solid, boring even, a certificate of deposit. But here's the twist. It's wrapped in gold paper and tied with the ribbon of exclusivity. The illusion is perfect, and millions would soon fall for it. Let's talk about these certificates of deposit, because they're crucial to understanding how Stanford pulled this off. A CD is one of the most conservative financial products out there. You hand your bank a lump sum, the bank locks it for a while, and you earn a fixed interest rate. The longer you wait, the better the rate. It's predictable, low risk, and boring, and that's why retirees love them. So, you can imagine how seductive it sounded when Stanford International Bank claimed they could give you 8 or even 10%. Guaranteed. Not risky stock market returns. Guaranteed bank savings. That word alone, guaranteed, was the honey in the trap. He wasn't just offering a financial product, he was selling a lifestyle. The whole operation was dressed up like luxury fashion. Brochures printed on thick, glossy paper showing serene Caribbean sunsets, smiling couples sipping wine, all labeled with Stanford's elegant S logo. The brand screamed wealth and comfort. When you received one of those CD offers, you felt like you'd been invited into an exclusive circle, like you were joining a private club where your money would be treated like royalty. That's no coincidence. Stanford understood that selling exclusivity makes people feel smarter than the crowd. Ever heard of the halo effect? It's a psychological trick where someone's success in one area makes you assume they're trustworthy in another. Stanford mastered it. He sponsored massive cricket tournaments. The Stanford 2020 Cup was practically a national event across the Caribbean. Famous players, live TV coverage, and millions of dollars in prize money. Every wicket, every cheer was a commercial for his bank. For many, it wasn't just a financial institution, it was a symbol of regional pride. After all, who wouldn't trust the guy making their national sport shine brighter? His offices were designed to impress. If you ever walked into one of those branch buildings, say in Miami or Caracas, you'd feel like you were entering a luxury resort more than a bank. Polished marble floors, leather sofas, friendly receptionists offering espresso. There were paintings on the walls and screens showing live market data. Everything whispered exclusive financial sophistication. It's Psychology 101. Make people associate you with success, and they'll trust you to multiply theirs. And it worked like magic. Soon, investors from Venezuela, Mexico, Spain, and even the United States wanted in. Many of them moved large chunks of their life savings into these CDs. Each client felt personally attended to. Private calls, tailored reports, updates showing their balances elegantly growing every quarter. It didn't even feel like investing. It felt like belonging. Stanford wasn't just selling returns, he was selling reassurance. That illusion was reinforced by an army of well-trained advisors. These people, often wearing impeccable suits and using fancy financial terms, were his evangelists. They spoke of diversified global portfolios and asset stability through international bonds. Many of them genuinely believed in the bank. They had invested their own money. They were victims too, unknowingly selling a scam wrapped as financial sophistication. It shows how powerful belief can be when dressed with data and confidence. Stanford also knew where to find opportunity. In Latin America, where decades of inflation, currency crashes, and banking collapses had made people skeptical of their local systems, his pitch sounded like salvation. "Send your money offshore," he said, "where it's safe, where the dollar protects you." And he wasn't entirely lying. Offshore accounts can indeed offer security. But his twist was that these returns were far higher than anything any legitimate offshore bank could promise. That gap, that impossible rate difference, is where common sense should have kicked in. But emotions beat logic every time. To boost credibility, Stanford's team often mentioned that the bank was regularly audited, its operations transparent, and its investments safely diversified across global markets. They'd throw around big names like bonds, hedge funds, sovereign debt. Clients rarely asked for details because few people want to look foolish questioning something they barely understand. It's the same dynamic that fuels most large scams. Complexity creates comfort. If something sounds too technical, you assume experts must be handling it. He also cultivated a clientele that added legitimacy just by association. Prominent business owners, local politicians, even athletes, people who drew others in. Word of mouth replaced advertising. If this person trusts Stanford, it has to be legit, the reasoning went. Social proof at its finest. Each new believer validated the illusion of safety and multiplied it. And there's something poetic about the timing. The early 2000s were an age of booming optimism. The global economy was flying high, housing markets were exploding, and investors were chasing yield like gold diggers chasing a new vein. In that mad rush, no one wanted to be the guy getting 5% when Stanford's clients bragged about earning 10. The fear of missing out, FOMO as you'd call it today, was just as powerful then. Stanford read the psychological climate perfectly. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever noticed how scams often thrive during good times, not crises? That's because people drop their guard when everything looks stable. In boom years, fraud hides under the noise of general success. It's only when the tide goes out that you see who's swimming naked. Stanford's empire relied entirely on that high tide, and as long as new deposits kept flowing, the music kept playing. Those certificates of deposit weren't just printed documents, they were stories. Each one symbolized hope, a comfortable retirement, a better home, maybe a college fund for someone's child. And that's what makes schemes like this so heartbreaking. It wasn't greed alone that drove people in. It was trust, sometimes even desperation. When traditional banks stopped caring about the little saver, Stanford appeared like a gentleman banker from another era. People wanted to believe that somewhere, someone still respected their savings. Now let's be fair. Stanford knew how to avoid looking like Bernie Madoff, who ran an even bigger Ponzi around the same time. While Madoff kept things exclusive and hidden on Wall Street, Stanford looked open and radiant under the Caribbean sun. His version had rum punch, cricket trophies, and smiles. The contrast was genius. One was the quiet fraud of elites. The other, the carnival of confidence played out in daylight. The more visible he became, the safer people felt. Paradoxical, right? Usually, when a business grows that flashy, you'd expect scrutiny. But Stanford flipped that logic. The more luxurious and public the operation, the fewer questions anyone asked. A fraudster in a dark alley triggers suspicion. A fraudster in a golf club buying everyone champagne earns applause. It's worth pausing to consider the psychology that made it all stick. When people invest, they don't just buy returns, they buy narratives. they buy the version of themselves they want to be. For retirees, Stanford represented security. For younger professionals, he represented success. And for Latin American clients weary of instability, he represented safety abroad. The same product, 3 different fantasies. That's powerful marketing, maybe even artful manipulation. By the mid-2000s, Stanford's bank held billions in deposits. The numbers looked flawless. The growth charted perfectly upward because he drew the graph himself. Investors would receive printed statements showing their money steadily compounding year after year. Not too fast, not suspiciously high, just the perfect slope to make it believable. It's amazing how far perception goes when backed by convincing paperwork and smooth talk. Meanwhile, regulators seemed hypnotized too. Though a few raised eyebrows about the unusually consistent growth, nothing concrete happened. His bank was offshore after all, and technically outside U.S. jurisdiction, as long as his affiliated brokerage firms in the States seemed compliant. The illusion stayed intact. It's like a magic trick performed in slow motion. So slow you don't realize the deception until the final reveal. But there were warning signs if you knew where to look. Independent auditors were mysteriously replaced. Some employees quietly left, whispering about discrepancies in financial statements. But in Stanford's world, loyalty was bought as easily as silence. Generous salaries, bonuses, and a glamorous workplace kept doubts buried. The Caribbean sun is a wonderful disinfectant for conscience. Everything looks cleaner than it is under that light. Looking back, you might wonder why no one stopped it sooner. The answer lies in incentives. Everyone around him was winning. Investors got returns. Governments got donations. Employees got prestige. When everyone benefits from the illusion, no one wants to question it. It's a perfect ecosystem for deceit. And yet, beneath the calm water, the storm clouds were already gathering. The global financial system was heading toward its biggest collapse in decades. Liquidity was drying up. Markets were wobbling. And even the safest institutions were starting to sweat. For someone running a pyramid disguised as a fortress, this was the nightmare scenario. The inflow of new money, the oxygen of the scheme, was slowing down. Without that, the whole thing would suffocate. Before that happened, though, Stanford enjoyed the peak of his legend. He was photographed shaking hands with world leaders, attending galas, flying across continents in his private jet. At one point, he even claimed he'd one day surpass Madoff himself in scale. Ironically, he wasn't wrong, but not in the way he hoped. History would soon remember him as one of the biggest financial illusionists of all time, not a banking visionary. So, the stage was set. Millions of dollars flowing in. An emperor dressed in white linen, his castles of paper decorated with confidence. He convinced entire nations that he had cracked the secret to safe, steady profits. And just like that, the world applauded, unaware they were watching a performance, not a business. But as with all great performances, the curtain must eventually fall. Up next, you'll see how the machinery behind the mirage actually worked, and what really kept those fake deposits glowing long after the truth had vanished into thin air. All right, now it's time to lift the curtain and see how the whole thing actually worked. Or better said, how it didn't. Because the Stanford empire wasn't powered by brilliant investments or secret Caribbean strategies. It was built on a simple formula as old as fraud itself. Take new money to pay old promises. Still, the way he packaged this ancient trick was almost artistic. He turned deception into a well-oiled financial machine designed to look cleaner than any legitimate bank you could find. Everything started with the illusion of diversity. On paper, Stanford International Bank claimed to invest in a mix of government bonds, blue-chip stocks, and conservative assets spread across the world. Clients saw beautiful charts full of perfect allocations, 30% in bonds, 25% in equities, a little real estate sprinkled on top. Balanced and professional looking, But those charts were fiction. The money that was supposedly invested rarely left the island. It sat in Stanford's personal accounts, feeding his lavish lifestyle and patching holes in his expanding Ponzi. Behind the scenes, there was no wall between customer deposits and Stanford's money. He used one giant pot for everything, from bank operations to private jets. Imagine a kitchen where every ingredient gets dumped into the same pot, no matter if it's for soup or dessert. That's basically how his finances worked. Officially, the auditors confirmed healthy returns year after year. But remember, those auditors weren't exactly the world's elite firms. They were obscure names no one had heard of, hired more for loyalty than for accuracy. The performance reports were masterpieces of accounting illusion. Every quarter, investors received statements showing consistent growth, about 10% annually, smooth and stable. No market volatility, no dips, no bad years. Sounds perfect, right? Too perfect, actually. In finance, there's no such thing as guaranteed smooth returns unless someone's making them up. Real markets are messy, unpredictable, full of ups and downs. Stanford's charts were straight lines marching upward like a ruler had drawn them. Those fake returns were the magic dust that kept everyone enchanted. New clients kept pouring in because existing clients looked so happy. Why wouldn't they? They saw profits, and some even withdrew part of their supposed earnings. Cash that came straight from new investors. It's like pulling money out of a hat, except the rabbit wasn't real. The entire scheme relied on constant inflows of fresh cash to maintain the illusion of liquidity and profitability. Now, you might ask, how did they pull this off logistically? Well, Stanford's operation was carefully layered with shell companies and subsidiaries. He had a financial ecosystem so complex that tracing where the money actually went was nearly impossible. One entity in Antigua handled deposits, another in Houston handled brokerage services, and multiple others were sprinkled across Latin America. Paperwork created barriers that made everything seem legitimate to regulators who lacked either the authority or the persistence to connect the dots. Stanford himself acted like a sun around which everything orbited. He made every key decision personally, approving expenditures, transfers, and even internal reports. Everything that looked like structure was really just show. Employees were told only what they needed to know. The inner circle, maybe half a dozen people at most, understood that the numbers didn't add up. Everyone else was caught in the illusion, too busy selling safe returns to notice the cracks forming beneath their feet. The magical word that kept the whole machine humming was confidentiality. Investors were told that the bank's proprietary investment strategy was secret, known only to Stanford and a few top analysts. That secrecy was spun as sophistication, a private formula that guaranteed constant growth. Ironically, that secrecy protected him from scrutiny. After all, when someone says their strategy is confidential, you either trust them or walk away. And almost everyone chose trust. Those who asked questions received reassurance in bulk. There'd be glossy brochures, personalized calls, and new data tables showing how the investments were supposedly diversified across regions and industries. It was financial theater, a staged performance where every number was a prop, and the actors, accountants, advisors, and even government officials who had no idea they were reading from a fraudulent script. Meanwhile, Stanford lived like royalty. Mansions in Houston, yachts moored in Antigua, a private jet bearing his initials, every luxury you can imagine. But that lifestyle wasn't the reward of business success. It was part of the illusion itself. It made him look more trustworthy. The psychology is wild, but true. Show enough wealth, and people assume competence. Wealth becomes the proof. Stanford understood this deeply, and he weaponized luxury as part of the scam. Let's think about that for a moment. Have you ever noticed how extravagance distracts from doubt? If you see someone donating millions to charity, building stadiums, and sponsoring national sports, you rarely think of them as crooks. The sheer scale of generosity builds what seems like credibility. That's exactly what Stanford exploited. The more he gave away, the less anyone suspected. In their minds, a criminal can't possibly be giving so much back. Behind all the glitter, though, things were starting to creak. Stanford's team needed to keep inventing new numbers to justify all the growth. That meant fabricating investment reports representing billions in non-existent assets. When auditors asked for documentation of trades or holdings, they were shown fake records, sometimes generated overnight. It's wild to think that $8 billion in supposed investments could exist entirely on spreadsheets. But that's the power of false paperwork and strong confidence when no one double-checks. Inside the bank, loyalty came with perks. High-level executives received luxury accommodations, generous bonuses, and the occasional Caribbean getaway, all paid from depositors' money. Some probably suspected the game wasn't fair, but the rewards were too good to question. Cognitive dissonance kicked in. People convinced themselves that everything was fine because their paychecks depended on it. Morality tends to fade when comfort grows too loud. As for the clients, most didn't even want to know how the returns worked. They just cared that it worked. Each quarter's statement was like a small dopamine hit confirming they were smarter than average. The illusion of stability did more than just protect Stanford. It addicted his investors. That emotional reinforcement, seeing your supposed wealth grow steadily, made them defend the bank even when small doubts appeared. It's like watching a magician pull off an impossible trick and applauding even after you start guessing how it's done. But illusions require constant control. To maintain it, Stanford's organization limited information flow ruthlessly. Employees were told to destroy sensitive documents, delete emails, and stay tight-lipped around auditors. Anyone who asked too many questions got quietly transferred or dismissed with a severance check and a confidentiality agreement. That hush-money culture sealed the cracks long enough for the facade to stand. Let's talk numbers. Well, written ones. By the mid-2000s, Stanford claimed over $8 billion in assets, while in reality, most of it was unverified or imaginary. Some estimates later showed that over 90% of the supposed portfolio didn't exist at all. It was a hollow empire supported by faith and formatted spreadsheets. If investors had ever demanded simultaneous withdrawals, the whole system would have collapsed overnight. Even regulators struggled to pin him down. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission received warnings more than once about Stanford's mysterious, too consistent returns. Yet jurisdictional confusion between the U.S. and Antigua meant no one had clear authority to intervene. That bureaucratic limbo bought him precious years. By the time anyone started asking serious questions, it was already too late. Thousands of lives were entangled in the illusion. It's fascinating, isn't it? The mechanics of this fraud weren't sophisticated in design. No high-frequency trading or exotic derivatives, just smoke, mirrors, and psychology. What made it powerful was the confidence and structure that surrounded it. Each layer of corporate jargon and professional presentation distanced the truth a little further from discovery. He didn't hide his empire in the shadows. He built it on open beaches and sunshine, knowing people would assume evil always lurks in the dark. There's a term for what Stanford created: financial mirage. From a distance, it looked like an oasis, profitable, refreshing, safe. But as you approached, it dissolved into shimmering air. Investors didn't lose money because they were stupid. They lost it because they were human. We're wired to trust symbols of authority and success. If you combine those symbols with complex language and confidence, you can sell fantasy as fact. To truly grasp the brilliance and cruelty of this system, think of it like a pyramid with 3 tiers. At the bottom were thousands of regular investors from dozens of countries, feeding the scheme with their deposits. Above them stood regional advisors and sales teams who believed they were offering legitimate, high-end financial products. At the top sat Stanford himself and a handful of close executives who orchestrated the illusion. The bottom two layers kept it alive. The top one kept it secret. The real genius of the scam wasn't technical. It was emotional. Stanford didn't just trick balance sheets. He tricked people into wanting his dream to be real. Hope is a powerful currency. If you give someone the belief that they found a safe place for their future, they'll protect that belief like it's sacred. And when others doubt, they'll defend it even harder. That psychological loyalty is what allowed the mirage to last far longer than reason predicted. Still, no fraud lasts forever. By the late 2000s, whispers started to grow louder. Investors began asking why they never saw evidence of specific holdings or detailed records of trades. And internally, a few brave employees began to notice how much effort went into hiding things that should have been routine. That's the signal of an empire reaching its limit. Not when it runs out of money, but when it runs out of lies that still make sense. You can almost feel the tension mounting at this point. On one side, a glossy public image that looks unshakable. On the other, an undercurrent of panic. The tighter Stanford's team tried to control the narrative, the more leaks started to appear. Small irregularities turned into headaches, then into red flags. The world was about to find out that the Caribbean Golden Boy wasn't managing wealth. He was borrowing time. Right before everything collapsed, there was still a moment of calm, a dangerous, deceptive calm. Stanford continued hosting events, smiling for cameras, and reassuring his employees that everything was fine. But behind the closed doors of his offices, panic had already set in. If a single major investor demanded proof of assets or tried to pull too much money at once, the illusion would shatter. The clock was ticking, and Stanford knew it. What's remarkable here is that even until the very end, his confidence never cracked. He kept promising more, fundraising harder, and spinning new narratives to buy time. It's like a magician adding one more trick even as the audience starts to notice the wires. That's the tragedy of delusion. Once you build your life around a lie, admitting the truth feels worse than collapse. Soon, Antigua's paradise would turn into the stage for one of the biggest unmaskings in financial history. Regulators, once passive, would wake up. Employees would start talking, and the illusion would crumble faster than anyone imagined. But before that dramatic fall, the system kept pretending everything was business as usual. The stage lights were still on, even as the props started burning. And that, my friend, is how Alan Stanford built his mirage. A masterpiece of manipulation, powered by psychology, trust, and tropical sunshine. A pyramid hidden in plain sight, run by a man who made fiction look profitable and lies feel reassuring. Next time, we'll dive into the moment when the facade began to break down, when the first cracks appeared, and paradise started leaking truth. Because no matter how strong a mirage looks, one gust of reality can make it vanish overnight. Things were still looking shiny on the surface. The yachts kept floating, the champagne glasses kept clinking, and Alan Stanford still wore that blinding white suit like a Caribbean king. But below that picture-perfect world, the foundations were trembling. The illusion that everything was under control was about to face its harshest test: the global financial crisis. It all started in the late 2000s, when financial institutions around the world began to crack. You remember those years, right? Banks collapsing, markets free-falling, and fear spreading faster than rumors on social media. Confidence was vanishing, and liquidity was drying up. For someone running a Ponzi scheme, that's like oxygen disappearing from the room. Because remember, Stanford didn't make profits. He recycled deposits. Without new money, the engine stopped turning. The trouble began subtly. Investors, spooked by the chaos in global markets, started asking questions. A few even wanted their money back, just for peace of mind. On the outside, that didn't seem alarming. After all, withdrawal requests happen all the time. But behind closed doors, every single redemption request was like a ticking bomb. The supposedly safe bank didn't have the funds to cover them. That serene paradise facade was beginning to melt under pressure. Stanford's team scrambled to keep up appearances. They reassured investors that everything was fine, that their diversified portfolio was actually benefiting from the downturn. They even claimed they were getting higher returns than ever because they'd anticipated the crisis. It was bold, almost comically so. But when you've lived off a lie that long, denial becomes second. He doubled down instead of slowing down. Inside Antigua, people began whispering. Some employees started noticing how often documents were being shredded, and confidential meetings increased. A few brave insiders started to question why the numbers they saw internally never matched the ones sent to clients. Stanford's response? He tightened control and switched from persuasion to intimidation. The golden gentleman mask was slipping, and what appeared underneath was a man desperate to keep his empire alive at any cost. And here's where irony joins the story. Stanford's own success had attracted attention. When the whole global banking sector was crumbling, his bank seemed untouched, even thriving. That stood out like a neon sign in the dark. Journalists started digging. Regulators revisited old complaints, and the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States began to whisper about reopening an investigation that had been shelved years earlier. Suddenly, Paradise felt less safe and a lot more transparent than he liked. You might think Stanford panicked, but no, he played it cool. Or at least, he pretended to. He called press conferences, gave interviews, and continued sponsoring sports events, insisting his operations were stable. Publicly, he projected confidence, but privately, panic spread. Staff turnover rose sharply. Some executives quietly resigned, sensing the coming storm. The inner circle began turning on each other, each trying to cover their tracks in case the hammer dropped. Meanwhile, customers' calls started flooding in. People wanted their cash. They didn't care about reports or quarterly statements anymore. They wanted proof. One by one, withdrawal requests stacked up faster than the bank could handle them. But in a Ponzi, when cash leaves faster than it enters, there's only one direction things go: down. By the time the crisis deepened, the hole was massive, billions deep and widening by the day. Stanford tried to buy time in typical showman fashion. He promised clients special bonuses for keeping their money in, even higher returns for rolling over their CDs instead of cashing them out. Can you imagine? He was bribing them with imaginary money to delay the inevitable. It worked for a moment, but confidence, once cracked, never seals back the same way. The first real test of trust had arrived, and his empire was bleeding from every corner. Around this time, a few brave whistleblowers emerged. One of them, a woman who had worked closely on the bank's finances, began raising hell inside the company. She noticed transactions that made no sense. Huge transfers with no documentation, fake investment files, and discrepancies between internal ledgers and public reports. She alerted external auditors, then regulators. For years, warnings had gone ignored. Now, under the glare of a global financial meltdown, people finally started to listen. Regulatory agencies launched quiet probes. At first, they whispered. Then they demanded documents. Stanford's lawyers stalled as long as possible. They knew time was both enemy and ally. Every extra week meant survival, but also more pressure. Meanwhile, rumors began hitting the media. Words like Ponzi, fraud, and fake investments started appearing next to his name in financial columns. For a man obsessed with image, that was nuclear-level damage. It's interesting to see how fast things can flip. Just months before, Alan Stanford was everyone's favorite billionaire, the sunlit version of a financial genius. Now, he was becoming radioactive. Politicians who once shook hands with him denied ever knowing him. business partners withdrew quietly. Even Antigua's government, which had knighted him and benefited massively from his investments, began to step back, fearing international backlash. When the tide turns in high finance, loyalty evaporates like morning mist. You could actually feel the tension in Antigua. The same locals who once adored Stanford's glamorous parties now whispered about raids and investigations. The mood shifted from celebration to suspicion. People began realizing that the man who had built sports complexes, schools, and hospitals might have done it all with money stolen from ordinary savers. The Caribbean paradise was about to become the scene of financial ruin for tens of thousands. Then came the moment that changed everything. A formal investigation in the United States. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which had long been criticized for ignoring red flags, finally acted. They launched an inquiry into Stanford's reported assets and demanded detailed proof of the investments backing all those shiny CDs. And guess what? The documents didn't add up. It was like pulling a thread on a sweater. The more they tugged, the faster the whole thing unraveled. When regulators pressed for clarity, Stanford's employees began to panic internally. They realized the game was nearly over. Financial officers scrambled to fabricate backup evidence, producing fake transaction trails and piecing together portfolios that didn't exist. It was chaos behind closed doors, but externally, Stanford remained calm, even smug. He told the press it was all a misunderstanding, that his business was too innovative for regulators to grasp. Classic deflection tactics. By early 2009, investigators had gathered enough evidence to act decisively. They discovered that over 90% of the bank's so-called investments were fictitious. That number is mind-blowing when you think about it. This wasn't a tiny accounting error. It was systemic deception. Within weeks, the SEC froze his assets and announced allegations of fraud. Headlines exploded worldwide. The Caribbean gentleman had officially fallen from grace. In Antigua, chaos erupted. Panic spread across the island as depositors lined up outside branches, desperate for answers. Employees were caught in tears, unable to explain to customers that their life savings were gone. What had once been a beacon of hope for the local economy turned into a symbol of betrayal. The illusion of prosperity evaporated overnight, and reality hit hard. The safe haven was nothing but smoke. The human cost started to emerge. Thousands of retirees lost their pensions. Families who had invested everything couldn't pay mortgages or college fees. Even small businesses that had trusted Stanford's bank for basic services faced bankruptcy. The ripple effect was brutal, crossing borders and generations. In more than 100 countries, people learned the hard way that trust, once misplaced, is the most expensive thing in the world. Stanford, remarkably, still believed he could charm his way out. He claimed he was a victim of misunderstanding and overregulation. He insisted the bank was solvent, that the crisis was temporary, and that once the dust settled, everything would return to normal. But no one was listening anymore. The illusion had fractured beyond repair. The man who built a fantasy on confidence had finally exhausted his own supply of it. You might wonder how he kept going even then. Some say delusion became his survival mechanism. For years, he had defined himself as a successful visionary, not a criminal. To suddenly confront that reality was psychologically impossible. Like a gambler doubling his bet after losing everything, he clung to denial as his last refuge. But reality doesn't care about ego. It always collects its due. The fall was as dramatic as his rise. Within days of the SEC's announcement, U.S. federal agents stormed his offices. Files were seized, computers confiscated, and high-ranking executives questioned. News cameras captured the scenes as if it were a movie. The billionaire of the Caribbean, surrounded by agents in windbreakers, his face twisted between defiance and disbelief. That image alone marked the end of an era of manufactured glamour. Think about it. Years of deceit, hidden behind charm and linen. Stanford's downfall wasn't just personal, it was institutional. It exposed how easily human psychology, weak regulation, and the allure of paradise can combine into something catastrophic. And it begged a painful question. How did so many smart people, including banks and governments, fail to see what was right in front of them? The answer lies in what we've been saying since the beginning. Everyone wanted to believe the fairy tale. When the final investigation results came out, the numbers were staggering. Over $5 billion missing. More than 30,000 victims scattered across 100 countries. Every fact pulled from the ashes painted the same picture. A colossal fraud hidden inside luxury. And behind every statistic was a story of someone who believed in the Caribbean dream and woke up to financial devastation. In the weeks that followed, the Stanford empire crumbled entirely. Assets were liquidated, employees dismissed, and government struggled to manage the political and economic fallout. For Antigua, it was more than an economic shock. It was a national humiliation. The island, once branded as a tax haven and financial sanctuary, had become synonymous with scandal. The beach sunsets now looked darker, as if the sun itself was ashamed to shine. So that's how paradise cracked. It didn't explode in one big moment. It eroded slowly until there was nothing left to hold it together. The perfect illusion finally met its breaking point under the weight of reality. Next, we'll dive into what came after. The chaos, the arrests, the anger, and the search for justice. Because if the first cracks in paradise were shocking, what followed was an earthquake that shook the entire financial world. The show lights dimmed faster than anyone expected. One day, Alan Stanford was the charming face of Caribbean finance. The next, his world collapsed like a sandcastle hit by a wave. The global headlines didn't hold back. Words like fraud, Ponzi, and deception screamed across every screen. His empire, once wrapped in silk and champagne, now smelled of panic and betrayal. But beyond the headlines were human stories. The 30,000 victims left adrift in the wreckage, and a man who refused to believe his performance was over. It all came to a head in early 2009. The United States government finally moved decisively. Agents raided Stanford's offices in Houston, seizing computers, boxes of files, and even artwork from his walls. It was the financial equivalent of a storm raid, the kind you see in movies but rarely in real life. Employees watched in shock as federal agents filled hallways. A surreal end to years of luxury and illusions. Stanford wasn't arrested immediately, but his name was already poison in every financial circle. Clients panicked. Phones rang non-stop. People who had trusted Stanford for years couldn't believe what they were hearing. Some burst into tears at their desks. Others refused to accept the truth, clinging to the hope that some miracle explanation would arrive. But Ponzi schemes have one rule: they work until they don't. The circle of trust imploded, and the reality of those fake certificates of deposit spread like wildfire across the globe. By the time Stanford faced formal charges, the figures were staggering. Over $5 billion missing. Over 30,000 victims across 100 countries. Think about that for a second. That's the population of a small city. People whose financial futures were destroyed in one swoop. Retirees, teachers, entrepreneurs, and even entire communities that had invested through local agents, all wiped out. It wasn't just money, it was dreams evaporating overnight. Investigators pieced together what we already know. Stanford International Bank was nothing more than a beautifully wrapped illusion. The assets were fake, the records manipulated, and the profits fabricated. What shocked everyone wasn't the crime itself, but its scale and longevity. How could something that big survive undetected for 2 decades? The answer, as always, lay in human and systemic failure. People believed because they wanted to. Regulators failed because they trusted the same image everyone else did. Stanford was finally arrested in Virginia after several days of evasion. The scene was strangely anticlimactic. No glamorous showdown, just a tired man in handcuffs stepping into a black SUV, while reporters shouted questions. He looked disoriented, even insulted, as if the world had misunderstood his genius. Perhaps that's the cruelest part. He still thought it was all a misunderstanding, that somehow his empire could come back. Denial is a powerful drug. When the charges landed, they hit hard. Fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, each carrying potential decades behind bars. The prosecutors described his operation as a massive ongoing scam, and they weren't exaggerating. The magnitude of missing funds alone placed Stanford among the worst white-collar criminals in living memory. And yet, inside that courtroom, he still radiated confidence, speaking as if the jury were potential investors. Some people can't switch off the performance. Meanwhile, the victims' stories began surfacing worldwide. Some lost everything: their homes, retirements, college funds for their children. Couples who had saved all their lives for a peaceful future suddenly faced bankruptcy. For investors in countries like Venezuela and Mexico, where Stanford's brand had represented stability against uncertain economies, the blow was especially cruel. Local offices closed overnight, leaving thousands stranded without information or compensation. The illusion didn't just collapse, it atomized. Regulators faced their own reckoning. The Securities and Exchange Commission came under fire for ignoring early warnings. Years before the collapse, whistleblowers had reported suspicious activity, but bureaucracy and confusion delayed meaningful action. That revelation triggered anger not just at Stanford, but at the entire system meant to protect consumers. After all, what's worse than being scammed? Learning that someone could have stopped it and didn't. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered how meticulously Stanford had woven his web. Offshore accounts in Antigua, secret transfers through multiple subsidiaries, phony investment portfolios, all designed to confuse anyone tracing the path. His headquarters looked pristine, his public appearances perfectly rehearsed, but his finances were chaos disguised as order. It's strange how the more elegant something looks on the surface, the more rot it can hide underneath. The trial dragged on for years, full of drama. Former executives turned against him, testifying about cooked books, manipulated reports, and orders from the top to keep quiet. Every revelation painted a clearer picture of how perfectly he had orchestrated trust. One employee admitted that the only real spreadsheets were the ones showing how much money came in and how much went out to old investors. Everything else was theater. Pure fiction reinforced with numbers that looked believable. Stanford's defense argued he was a legitimate businessman caught in financial misunderstanding. He claimed bad accounting, not fraud, and insisted he planned to repay investors once markets stabilized. But his words fell flat. Evidence showed he had lied repeatedly, destroyed documents, and personally authorized hundreds of millions in personal expenses paid from clients' deposits. That's not bad bookkeeping. That's theft with a tan and a smile. When Judgment Day came, reality finally hit hard. The court sentenced him to 110 years in prison, a lifetime, and then some. It's poetic justice in a way. The man who promised eternal stability found himself confined forever. As the judge read the sentence, Stanford stood motionless, still talking about appeals and conspiracies. The showman couldn't stop performing, even as the curtain hit the floor. But beyond the courtroom, the damage lived on. Recovery efforts became a marathon fight. Receivers worked relentlessly to locate and repatriate whatever assets were left. But with money spread across dozens of countries and disguised through layers of offshore registrations, most victims would never get their full savings back. Some recovered small portions years later, but the psychological trauma outlasted the financial loss. Trust, once burned, doesn't regenerate easily. Antigua itself was left with a scar that would take generations to heal. The island that once welcomed Stanford as a savior faced international criticism. Its image as a haven of sunshine finance turned into a warning label. Locals who had worked at his bank became pariahs through no fault of their own. For a small nation dependent on tourism and offshore banking, the collapse was both economic and symbolic. The paradise was forever tainted. Stanford's personal empire vanished just as quickly as it rose. His private jets, yachts, and mansions were seized and auctioned off. Even his beloved cricket stadium, once a source of island pride, fell into decay. The same field that had hosted championships and celebrations now stood silent, a graveyard for dreams built on deceit. Time has a dark sense of humor. It leaves ruins as reminders of hubris. What's fascinating about this part of the story isn't just the fall, but how predictable it was in hindsight. Every red flag had been there. The unrealistic returns, the secrecy, the charisma that dismissed hard questions. Yet people ignored them because they wanted to believe in the fairy tale. Stanford didn't invent greed. He just learned how to play it like a violin. His investors were humans chasing hope. And that's what makes this scheme both tragic and painfully familiar. Psychologists later described his personality as narcissistic, manipulative, even delusional. He lived so deeply inside his own myth that he couldn't separate himself from it anymore. His empire collapsing wasn't just financial, it was existential. When your identity and your lie are the same thing, losing one destroys the other. In a way, Alan Stanford never survived the arrest. The man wearing the white suit died the day reality caught up with him. Still, his story leaves important lessons for all of us. It shows how easily trust can be exploited, how regulation fails when dazzled by wealth, and how seductive confidence can override logic. The Stanford scandal wasn't just about one man. It was about an entire financial culture that equates success with moral worth. When that illusion shatters, the cost isn't just in dollars, it's in faith. Faith in systems, in expertise, in honesty. The cleanup took years. Courts in multiple countries coordinated to trace his assets, recover funds, and prosecute those who helped. Victims organized networks to pressure governments and share information. Some found partial restitution, others got nothing. To this day, many still live with that bitterness, the knowledge that a lifetime of savings vanished into someone else's fantasy. And there's no insurance for stolen hope. Stanford now sits in a federal prison, far from the turquoise waters that once reflected his ego. His white suits replaced by gray uniforms, his empire replaced by a small cell. It's a grim irony that a man who once controlled billions can't buy a single moment of freedom. He spends his days writing appeals, denying guilt, and clinging to the remnants of a story no one believes anymore. The applause has ended, but he still thinks the crowd is waiting. And that's the endgame of every fraud. When the music stops, the lights go out, and the audience leaves, the performer is left alone with the echo of his lies. Alan Stanford played his role longer than most, but the script was doomed from the first line. His story is a monument to ambition without restraint and trust without verification. Next, we'll talk about what comes after the fall, what we can learn from it, and how to avoid the next charming con man who promises paradise at a bargain price. So, here we are at the end of the story. Or maybe the beginning of the real one. Alan Stanford may be locked away, but the questions he left behind still echo in the corridors of finance. How did it happen? Why did so many fall for a dream that screamed, "Too good to be true"? And most importantly, what can we learn to make sure this doesn't happen again? Because at the heart of it all, this wasn't just about one man. It was a mirror reflecting our relationship with money, trust, and ambition. Let's start with the obvious. Every large financial fraud begins with a promise, safety wrapped in exceptional profit. It's an irresistible combination because it touches two of our strongest desires, security and reward. Stanford sold both in one neat package, and he sold it with charisma. He made people feel like insiders to a secret world of prosperity. There's a powerful lesson here. When someone promises high returns with zero risk, your alarm bells should scream louder than your greed. But don't be too harsh on the victims. In a way, they were ordinary people looking for stability in a volatile world. Many lived in countries where banks collapse more often than governments change. Others were retirees trying to protect their savings from inflation. Stanford understood that fear perfectly. He didn't sell greed, he sold reassurance. And that's what makes his fraud particularly cruel. It preyed not on thirst for excess, but on the craving for peace of mind. The second lesson lies in oversight, or rather, the lack of it. Regulators failed spectacularly in Stanford's case. For years, red flags piled up. Inconsistent data, impossible returns, shifting auditors. Yet agencies paralyzed by jurisdiction limits or bureaucratic delay did nothing. It's a painful reminder of how global finance has outgrown national supervision. Scams can now operate across borders faster than laws can chase them. In a world where money moves at digital speed, oversight still crawls like it's written on paper. And here's the third lesson. Perception beats truth until the music stops. Stanford looked legitimate because he acted legitimate. He wore the right suits, spoke the language of elites, and surrounded himself with symbols of credibility. Titles, awards, sponsorships, all props in an expensive play. It shows that due diligence isn't just a technical process, it's an emotional one. We don't check facts when our instincts are lulled by appearances. If someone looks like success, we assume they must be. You might find it strange, but there's a psychological term that explains this: cognitive dissonance. Once people invest emotionally, they defend their decision even when evidence says otherwise. That's why so many of Stanford's clients refused to believe the fraud until the very end. They had built their self-worth around being wise investors. To admit the truth wasn't just losing money, it was losing identity. It's easy to laugh at others' mistakes, but anyone could fall into that trap under the right conditions of charm and hope. Now, you might ask, could a Stanford happen again? The uncomfortable truth is yes. Different setting, different tools, same principles. The technology changes. The stage shifts from Caribbean banks to crypto exchanges or crowdfunding schemes. But the psychology remains identical. Confidence, secrecy, fake legitimacy, it's all recyclable. The next con artist might not sell certificates of deposit. They might sell digital coins, green energy tokens, or fake NFTs. Same illusion, new vocabulary. That's why financial literacy matters more than ever. Understanding how money actually works isn't just a skill for economists, it's self-defense. When you know what realistic returns look like, you spot lies instantly. When you understand risk, you stop expecting miracles. Stanford thrived because too few people asked basic questions like, where does the yield actually come from? If you can't answer that, you're not investing. You're gambling blindfolded. Another uncomfortable truth is that greed doesn't live only at the bottom. Institutions, politicians, and celebrities also played roles in sustaining the illusion. Governments loved the tax revenue. Athletes loved the sponsorship money. Influencers loved the association with success. Everyone got something until the pyramid crashed. The Stanford saga proves that corruption isn't always about bribes or violence. It's often about silence in exchange for convenience. But let's not end on cynicism. There are positive takeaways too. After Stanford's collapse, regulatory bodies worldwide toughened transparency rules for offshore banks. Some countries demanded third-party audits and stronger anti-fraud frameworks. The phrase, "too good to be true," started resonating again in the public conversation. Sometimes, pain becomes the tuition fee for collective wisdom. Costly, yes, but necessary. Still, human memory fades faster than it should. Each generation seems to rediscover the same scams under new disguises. Remember how in the early 2000s, everyone trusted mortgage derivatives? Or how in the 2010s, we saw crypto schemes promising guaranteed 10% weekly returns? The technology changes, the face of the fraudster evolves, but the story repeats like an old record. The only constant is the audience, us, convinced that this time it's different. Let's dig a little deeper into that psychology, because it's key. People love stories about shortcuts, the idea that someone discovered a hidden formula to beat the system. Stanford packaged himself as that guy, the genius who outsmarted conventional banks. That archetype never dies. It appeals to ambition, especially in skeptical times when traditional finance feels broken. Believing in the rebel genius feels empowering, until you realize he's no hero, just another opportunist selling illusion dressed as innovation. And yet, even after everything, part of the fascination remains. Why do we still obsess over figures like Stanford? Maybe because his story mirrors something universal, the fragile line between vision and delusion. Entrepreneurs, investors, even dreamers all walk that edge. The difference is honesty. Visionaries build bridges. Fraudsters build mirages. Both inspire until the truth separates them. That's why stories like this one need to be told. Not to laugh at the fall, but to learn where we might slip next. The Stanford case also exposed how little accountability existed in the offshore world. Secrecy jurisdictions acted like financial twilight zones, half legal, half moral. That system didn't just allow Stanford to thrive, it encouraged him. Transparency may be boring, but it's the only sunlight fraud fears. If regulators can't track money, they can't protect people. So, lesson 4. Never trust any market where secrecy is the selling point. The safest havens often hide the biggest traps. We can't forget the emotional aftermath either. The victims of Stanford's scheme didn't just lose savings. They lost confidence in everything. Many stopped investing altogether. Some turned cynics, convinced that all finance is rotten. That's tragic, because trust is the fuel economies run on. Without it, systems freeze. Rebuilding that trust requires more than compensation. It requires education and ethics in equal measure. Otherwise, another Stanford just waits in line to take the stage. What's beautiful, though, is how some survivors rebuilt their lives. A few used the experience to educate others, warning new investors to research before diving in. Others wrote books, launched advocacy networks, or helped shape policy reforms. Pain became purpose. Out of one man's deception emerged thousands of tiny flames of awareness that now light the financial landscape a bit brighter. It proves that even the worst fraud can leave behind something useful: resilience. It's also a call to humility. We like to think we could never be tricked, that only naive people fall for scams. But remember, Stanford's victims included accountants, executives, and seasoned investors. Intelligence doesn't immunize you from persuasion. Overconfidence does the opposite. It turns skepticism off. The smartest minds often make the best targets because they assume they'll recognize danger. Fraud thrives on that arrogance as much as on ignorance. In the end, Stanford's downfall serves as a parable. It's a story about how charisma can blind oversight, how trust can be engineered like a product, and how fantasy can masquerade as finance. It's also a story about resilience. The world didn't stop turning after him. It adapted, strengthened, and moved on. But the shadow of his fraud lingers as a reminder that paradise isn't always safe just because it glitters under the sun. If you've followed this story from the first chapter, You now understand that the Stanford case wasn't just about tropical luxury and fake deposits. It was about human, and that's why it remains relevant. Wherever money flows, temptation follows. Wherever systems grow opaque, someone's probably exploiting them. Being financially literate, skeptical, and alert is no longer a luxury. It's survival in the modern economy. Before wrapping up, let's remember one final truth. The next great fraud will probably look friendlier, more digital, and far more sophisticated. It'll come with sleek websites, glowing endorsements, even verified badges. Don't expect villains in white suits anymore. They'll wear hoodies and run apps. But the core will be the same. Someone promising effortless wealth while hiding the fine print. The tools change, but the trick never does. So what can you do? Simple steps, really. Ask questions that pierce through the story. Who holds your money? What exactly generates the return? Can you verify it independently? Diversify instead of chasing miracles, and remember that legitimate wealth grows slower than marketing slogans. There's no shame in being cautious. Caution is how you keep freedom in your own hands. Alan Stanford's saga may have ended in a prison cell, but the real test is what we, the audience, take from it. We can let it fade as just another true crime story, or we can see it as a manual on how trust and greed dance together in modern finance. The Caribbean Mirage was built by one man, but dismantling illusions is everyone's duty. Because every time one person stops to think before signing, a new Ponzi dies unborn. And that's it, the final scene. The yachts are gone, the champagne flat, the island quiet again. But the echoes of this story still roll like distant waves reminding us, wealth built on lies sinks fast, but knowledge stays afloat. So keep your curiosity alive, trust carefully, and never forget, behind every golden promise, check where the gold actually comes from.